The dust of Millbrook tasted like failure. It coated Matthew Reed's tongue, a gritty film of grit and regret that the water from the sheriff's canteen couldn't wash away. He stood inside the Millbrook bank, the stolen canvas bag clutched in one hand, the cold weight of the teller's pistol in the other. He hadn't wanted the gun. He hadn't wanted any of this. The air was thick with the scent of old paper ink and the sharp metallic tang of fear rising from the two men cowering behind the counter. Outside, the sun beat down on the town's single dusty street, a merciless eye in a bleached blue sky. But inside the bank, shadows clung to the corners, long and cool and deep. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden deafening silence. It had happened so fast. One moment he was pleading with Doc Adams, his voice cracking with a desperation that bordered on madness. The next, he was here a common thief, with the shouts of a posse gathering outside. "Please," the younger teller whimpered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Just take the money and go." Matthew's gaze flickered to the bag in his hand. It wasn't enough. He knew it the moment the teller had shoved it across the counter. Not nearly enough for the medicine. Doc Adams' price was a king's ransom, a cruel joke played on a man who had nothing left. Mountain fever's a swift disease, Reed. The doctor had said, his voice slick with false sympathy. The quinine is rare, expensive. Come back when you have the coin. He didn't have coin. He had a lifetime of solitude in the high country, calloused hands that knew the feel of an axe handle better than $1, and a hollow ache in his chest where his wife's memory lived. And now, he had a daughter, Lily, burning with a fire that was consuming her from the inside out. Her shallow breaths were the only sound in his quiet cabin, a constant ragged reminder of his helplessness. His fingers tightened around the object in his pocket, a small cool circle of silver against his thigh. He pulled it out, his thumb tracing the familiar worn engraving of a mountain jay on its surface. The locket. Sarah's. She had given it to him the day they were married, her smile as bright as the high country sun. "So you'll always find your way back to me," she'd whispered. He had found his way back, but too late. A rock slide had taken her a year ago, swift and merciless, leaving him with nothing but the locket and their 7-year-old daughter. Now the world was trying to take Lily too. "It's the sheriff," the older teller hissed, his eyes wide. "He's got you surrounded." Matthew looked through the bank's large front window. The red sand of the street glowed under the sun, churned by the hooves of a half-dozen horses. Men with rifles leveled them at the door, their faces grim, their forms wavering in the oppressive heat. He was trapped. A cornered animal. But he wasn't a killer. He had never taken a life, man or beast, without necessity. He looked down at the heavy pistol in his hand. It felt alien, a tool of destruction he had no right to wield. He thought of Lily, her small face flushed with fever, her eyes clouded with pain. He had failed her. He had come down from his mountain sanctuary seeking a miracle, and had become a criminal instead. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had come. His only concern was the medicine. The medicine he couldn't buy, couldn't steal. With a ragged sigh that felt like it was torn from his soul, he let the pistol clatter to the wooden floor. He raised his empty hands, and the silver locket still clutched in his right fist, a small, cold comfort. He walked slowly toward the door, his steps heavy with the weight of his failure. He didn't fight back when they burst in, didn't flinch as they slammed him against the wall and bound his wrists with iron shackles. He only looked past the hard faces of the lawmen, his gaze fixed on Doc Adams' apothecary across the street, its windows dark and unforgiving. He had failed, and Lily would pay the price. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the weary town of Millbrook. It baked the cracked earth, bleached the wooden storefronts to a uniform shade of bone white, and drew a shimmering haze from the red sand that coated everything in a fine, gritty dust. A saloon sign, its paint peeling to reveal the weathered wood beneath, creaked a mournful rhythm in the hot, dry wind. The faces of the settlers who trudged along the boardwalk were etched with dust and hardship, their eyes narrowed against the relentless glare. In the relative cool of Mrs. Eleanor Whitman's boarding house, Ruth Ward worked in silence. Her world was confined to the scent of lye-soaked boiled linens and the faint, ever-present smell of dust that even her most vigorous scrubbing could not erase. With calloused fingers, she pushed a needle through a thick wool shirt, her stitches small, and even a testament to a lifetime of mending things that were not her own. At 28, she had learned the art of invisibility, to move without being noticed, to speak without being heard, to exist in the margins where trouble was less likely to find her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her simple gray dress, patched and repatched until it was a map of its own history, was a uniform of submission. Born into bondage, she had been a line item in a ledger, her entire life sold from one master to the next, until she landed here in this frontier outpost, indentured to the Whitmans, to pay off a debt that was not hers, a debt that grew larger with every passing month of meager room and board tacked onto the principal. "Put your back into it, girl," a sharp voice cut through the quiet. Mrs. Whitman stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her formidable chest. She was a woman carved from granite, her features sharp and her eyes holding the cold, critical light of a perpetual winter. "Mr. Kane will be by for his accounts this afternoon. This place needs to be spotless. He doesn't abide slovenliness." Ruth kept her eyes on her work, nodding her assent. "Yes, ma'am." Silas Kane. The name hung in the air like a threat. He was the shadow that loomed over Millbrook, a wealthy landowner who owned the bank, the general store, and the debts of half the town, including the mortgage on Mrs. Whitman's boarding house. To the public, he was a pillar of the community, a generous benefactor who had funded the new church steeple. He dressed in tailored Eastern suits that seemed out of place in the dusty West, and his voice was always calm, cultured, and controlled. But Ruth had seen the coldness in his eyes when he looked at people, a detached assessment, as if he were calculating their worth down to the last penny. There was a watchfulness about him, a stillness that hinted at something coiled and dangerous beneath the polished surface. A commotion from the street drew Mrs. Whitman to the window. "Well, I'll be she muttered, a rare flicker of interest in her voice. "Looks like the sheriff finally caught himself a real outlaw." Ruth risked a glance over the widow's shoulder. She saw the posse, the grim-faced men, and the figure they dragged between them. Bound and bloodied, a mountain of a man, with hair as dark as a raven's wing, stumbled along the street. Even brought low, there was an untamed wildness about him, a spirit that seemed to belong to the high peaks and endless skies, not to this dusty cage of a town. His gaze lifted for a moment, sweeping across the storefronts, and for a heartbeat, his steel-gray eyes met hers. In them she saw not the defiance of a hardened criminal, but a profound and shattering grief. It was a look she recognized, for she saw it in her own reflection every morning. The look of a soul trapped in a cage not of its own making. The trial was a formality, a piece of theater for the town's benefit. Matthew stood before the bench, and the iron shackles on his wrists, a cold, heavy reality. The air in the makeshift courtroom held in the town's largest saloon was stagnant and smelled of stale beer and sweat. Judge Harrison, a portly man with a face florid as a sunset, peered down at him over his spectacles, his expression one of deep satisfaction. He was a man who enjoyed the simple certainties of guilt and punishment. "Matthew Reed," the judge boomed, his voice echoing in the crowded room. "You have been found guilty of bank robbery. Have you anything to say before I pass sentence?" Matthew's jaw was a hard line. He remained silent. He could have told them about Lily. He could have explained the desperation that had driven him to this. But what was the point these people wouldn't understand? To them he was a savage, a wild man from the mountains. His grief was his own. He would not put Lily's memory on display for their judgment, or worse, their pity. He would protect the last sacred thing he had left. The judge sniffed, clearly irritated by the defendant's lack of repentance. Very well. As you possessed no property to be seized for restitution and no family to pay your debt to the community. If I may, Your Honor, a smooth, calm voice interrupted from the front row. A path cleared as Silas Kane rose to his feet. He adjusted the lapels of his fine wool coat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He commanded the room's attention without raising his voice. It seems to me, Kane began his tone reasonable, almost benevolent, that incarceration would be an unproductive expense for this town. The man is strong. He is clearly capable of hard labor. Perhaps there is a more constructive solution. Judge Harrison leaned forward, suddenly attentive. What do you have in mind, Mr. Kane? Kane's gaze swept over the crowd, finally landing on Ruth, who stood near the back, a silent observer in the shadows. He had arranged for her presence a summons delivered by Mrs. Whitman that morning. The victim of this crime was the bank which I own. However, the true disruption was to our community's sense of security. The woman who works for Mrs. Whitman, Ruth Ward, is herself working to pay off a debt. A long and arduous one, I understand. He paused, letting the implications settle. I propose a charitable solution. Let this man's sentence be to work off his debt. Let his labor be indentured to Miss Ward under the supervision of her current mistress, Mrs. Whitman. In this way, he repays his debt not with coin, but with sweat, and his labor might even assist the young woman in settling her own obligations more swiftly. A murmur went through the crowd. It was an elegant, almost biblical solution. An eye for an eye, a debt for a debt. Judge Harrison beamed, seeing a perfect way to dispense justice without costing the town a penny. A brilliant and generous proposal, Mr. Kane, he declared. They brought Ruth forward. She stood before the bench, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her head bowed. She could feel every eye in the room on her. She was being given a man, like a piece of livestock. The humiliation was a burning coal in her stomach. Miss Ward, the judge said, do you accept this arrangement? She had no choice. To refuse would be to defy not only the court, but Silas Kane himself. She raised her head slowly, her dark eyes finding Matthews across the room. She saw the flicker of protest in his gaze, the flash of a wild thing being caged. Then she looked at Kane. He was watching her, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. It was the smile of a chess master who has just moved a pawn into a critical position. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the silent room. I will do as I am bid. But her eyes locked on Kane's said something else entirely. They held a spark of defiance, a promise that while he might own her contract, he would never own her spirit. It was a promise she intended to keep. Matthew's first night of servitude was spent in the root cellar. The air was damp and cold, thick with the earthy smell of potatoes and packed dirt. A single heavy chain was shackled to his ankle, its other end bolted to a thick support beam. He was an animal tethered in a den. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood of the beam, the splinters catching on his calloused skin. He had gone from the boundless freedom of the peaks to a 6-foot length of chain in a hole in the ground. The irony was so bitter, it felt like swallowing poison. He heard the scrape of the cellar door and saw the flicker of lamplight on the stone steps. Ruth descended slowly, balancing a tin plate and a cup of water. She set them on the dirt floor just within his reach, her movements quiet and deliberate. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. In the soft glow of the lamp, he saw the fresh bruise blooming on her cheek, a dark purple shadow against her pale skin. A gift from Mrs. Whitman, no doubt, for the trouble he had brought to her household. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them. He saw not pity in her gaze, but a deep, weary recognition. She knew this cage. She had lived in it her whole life. He was just a newcomer. The days that followed fell into a brutal, monotonous rhythm. Mrs. Whitman, acting on what Matthew suspected were detailed instructions from Cain, worked him from before sunrise until long after sunset. His tasks were the Sisypheans splitting endless cords of wood that seemed to replenish themselves overnight, hauling buckets of water from the well until his shoulders screamed in protest, mucking out the stable, repairing the fence, and 100 other back-breaking chores designed to grind him down. The widow watched him constantly, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, quick to punish the slightest perceived infraction with a missed meal or a tightening of his evening chain. Ruth continued her own endless duties inside the house, a ghost in a gray dress scrubbing floors, washing linens, and cooking meals for the boarding house guests. They moved in separate orbits, yet they were acutely aware of each other. A shared glance across the yard, a brief moment of proximity when she came to hang laundry near where he was chopping wood. These fleeting connections became lifelines in a sea of drudgery. The mystery of his situation gnawed at him. Why Cain? Why this elaborate punishment? It felt personal, targeted. The answer, or the first piece of it, came from an unlikely source. An old grizzled prospector named Jed, who was a permanent resident of the boarding house, was sitting on the porch one afternoon, cleaning his rifle as Matthew repaired a broken step. Matthew had taken to wearing Sarah's locket on a leather cord around his neck, tucked under his shirt. The heat had made him unbutton the collar, and the silver disc had swung free. Jed's weathered eyes narrowed. "Where'd you get that?" he rasped, his voice like gravel in a pan. Matthew tucked the locket away. "It was my wife's." "Let me see it." Jed insisted, his tone sharp. Reluctantly, Matthew pulled it out. The old man leaned in, squinting at the emblem of the mountain jay. "I'll be damned. The Blackwood jay. Haven't seen that mark in years." "It's just a bird," Matthew said gruffly. "Ain't just a bird, son," Jed corrected. "That was the mark of the foreman at the Blackwood Ridge mine. A good man, they said. Went down with the rest of 'em." He shook his head, a shadow passing over his face. "Terrible business, that. A whole family wiped out. The owner's wife and 2 little ones. Happened about 8-9 years back. A methane blast. Sealed the whole shaft." Matthew felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. Who owned the mine? Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Fella who owns most everything else around here now. Silas Cain." The old prospector looked from the locket to Matthew's face, his expression suddenly wary. "You best be careful, son. Cain's a man who don't forget. And he don't forgive. That mine disaster. It changed him. Made him cold. Hard. If he's got an interest in you, it ain't for no good reason." The warning settled in Matthew's gut like a block of ice. It wasn't about the bank robbery. It had never been about the bank robbery. This was about Blackwood Ridge. That night, when Ruth brought him his meager meal in the cellar, he broke their unspoken rule of silence. "I need to know something," he whispered, his voice urgent as she set the plate down. "About Silas Cain." She looked around nervously, her eyes wide in the dim light. "It's not safe to talk." "Please," he insisted. "The old prospector Jed, he told me about a mining accident at a place called Blackwood Ridge." Ruth's breath hitched. "My first master worked that mine." I was just a girl, but I remember the talk. A terrible tragedy. They said the foreman was to blame. Kane owned it, Matthew stated, watching her face. She nodded, her expression grim. It was his family that was lost. They were no longer just two prisoners sharing a cage. They were conspirators piecing together a puzzle whose edges were sharp with danger. Their hushed conversations in the cellar, stolen in the dead of night, became a desperate search for answers. Why was Kane so interested in him, and what did the Blackwood J locket have to do with it? Their shared purpose forged a bond between them stronger than any chain, a fragile alliance against the powerful man who seemed to be pulling the strings of their lives. The investigation became a silent, dangerous dance conducted in the margins of their days. While Matthew toiled outside, he kept his ears open, listening to the gossip of travelers and the loose talk of the townspeople who frequented the boarding house. Ruth, moving invisibly through the rooms, became his eyes. She observed Kane's weekly visits to Mrs. Whitman, noting the closed-door meetings, the low, intense murmur of their conversations, and the way the widow seemed even more nervous and cruel after he departed. They pieced together fragments of information in their nightly cellar meetings. Ruth learned from a traveling surveyor that Silas Kane had been quietly buying up all the worthless scrub-covered land surrounding the old defunct Blackwood Ridge mine. He paid top-dollar offering prices no one could refuse for land that was good for nothing but rattlesnakes and lizards. It made no sense. One afternoon, Kane himself stopped by the boarding house yard where Matthew was splitting logs. He didn't address Matthew directly, merely stood watching for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. But as Matthew swung the axe, the locket swung free from his shirt again, glinting in the harsh sunlight. Kane's eyes, cold and dark as a winter river, locked onto the silver disc. A flicker of something visceral and hateful passed across his features before being instantly suppressed, replaced by his usual mask of calm detachment. But Matthew had seen it. The glance was a confirmation, a key turning in a lock. The locket was at the center of this. Their greatest breakthrough came from a moment of carelessness. Mrs. Whitman, flustered after a particularly tense meeting with Kane, left his payment ledger open on her desk. Ruth, entering the room to clear away the tea service, saw the entry. Dr. Adams. Final payment. Discretion assured. The amount was staggering, far more than a simple country doctor could earn in a year. That night, in the damp chill of the cellar, she told Matthew. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Doc Adams hadn't denied him the medicine because it was too expensive. He had denied it on Kane's orders. Kane had orchestrated it all. He had ensured Matthew's daughter would die, driving him to a desperate act. The bank robbery, the trial, the indenture, it was all a meticulously crafted trap. Kane hadn't just wanted him punished. He had wanted him broken and delivered into his hands. The shared danger and the sense of being the only two people in the world who understood the truth drew them closer. Their whispered conversations were no longer just about Kane. They began to share the stories of their own lives. He told her about Sarah, about the quiet joy of their life in the mountains, a life that felt like it belonged to another man. He spoke of his guilt and the crushing weight of believing he could have done more to save her from the rock slide. Ruth, in turn, spoke of a childhood she could barely remember, of her mother's gentle hands and the taste of wild berries. She shared the bleak, colorless story of her life in bondage, the endless series of masters, the casual cruelty, the slow erosion of hope. In the oppressive darkness of the cellar, they gave each other the gift of being seen, of being understood. One evening, after she had recounted a particularly brutal memory, her voice trembled and broke. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs she had held back for years. Matthew, straining against the length of his chain, reached for her. His large, calloused hand gently touched her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, But for Ruth, who had known only rough or indifferent hands, her entire life, it was a profound kindness. She looked up, tears tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. He shuffled closer, his hand moving to cup her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The harsh lines of his face, carved by years of mountain wind and sun, were softened by a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Ruth," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Her name on his lips was not an order or a label, but a prayer. He leaned in, and the kiss that followed was inevitable. It was gentle at first, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. Then it deepened, a raw, desperate expression of months of shared suffering, stolen glances, and suppressed longing. It was a moment of solace in a world that had offered them none, a silent vow that they were no longer alone. When they finally broke apart, the air between them was charged heavy with the weight of their new, dangerous reality. "This is dangerous," she whispered, her voice shaky, but she made no move to pull away. "I know," Matthew replied, his gaze intense. "But I've been dead inside for so long, Ruth. You make me feel alive." Their love was a secret garden, cultivated in the shadows, a fragile bloom in the most barren of soil. But Mrs. Whitman was no fool. She saw the change in them, the lighter step in Ruth, the spark of defiance that had returned to Matthew's eyes. She began to watch them, her suspicion a tangible presence in the house, coiling like a snake, waiting for the moment to strike. The strike came on a bitterly cold February morning. A leak in the pantry roof had soaked a sack of flour, and Matthew had been summoned to move the heavy, sodden mess. Ruth was there trying to salvage what she could. For a moment they were alone. He was helping her reach a tin of salt on a high shelf, his body close to hers, his hand resting on her waist to steady her. It was a brief, innocent touch, but in the charged atmosphere of the boarding house, it was a lit fuse. The door flew open, and Mrs. Whitman stood there, her face a mask of purple rage. Her shriek of outrage was a physical blow. "Shameless harlot, and you mountain savage, corrupting my property right under my own roof." Her screams brought guests and staff running. The humiliation was swift and public. She grabbed a leather strap from a peg on the wall, the one she used for beating rugs, and advanced on Ruth. "You will learn your place, girl," she hissed. Matthew moved to step between them, a protective roar building in his chest. But the sheriff and his deputy, who had been conveniently taking their morning coffee in the dining room, grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. "Please," Matthew begged, his voice breaking, as he watched the strap rise and fall, each blow landing with a sickening thwack against Ruth's thin dress. She crumpled to her knees, but made no sound, her silence a greater act of defiance than any scream. "Punish me instead. She did nothing wrong." Mrs. Whitman paused, her chest heaving. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her face. From the doorway, a figure stepped forward. It was Silas Kane. He had been there all along, watching from the shadows of the hall. He didn't move to stop it. He simply observed his expression, one of chilling personal satisfaction. It was the look of a scientist watching a carefully prepared experiment reach its expected conclusion. "Oh, you'll both be punished," Mrs. Whitman said, her eyes flicking to Kane for approval. "But first, this whole town is going to see what happens to servants who forget their place." That evening, after hours of being displayed in the town square like trophies, their backs raw and bleeding, they were thrown into their separate prisons. But before the cellar door was bolted shut, on Matthew Kane appeared, dismissing the deputy with a flick of his wrist. He descended the stone steps, his polished boots making no sound on the dirt floor. The lamplight cast his face in sharp, predatory angles. He stopped just out of Matthew's reach and stared at him for a long, silent moment. The Blackwood J. Kane said softly, his voice a silken threat. "A handsome emblem. It belonged to the foreman, a man named Thomas Reed. Your brother. Matthew froze. He hadn't spoken his brother's name in 9 years. He gave you that locket, didn't he? Kane continued, his voice conversational yet laced with venom. The day before the collapse. A good luck charm. But his luck ran out. And yours began. You were there that day, Matthew. Down in the shaft. The sole survivor. Kane took a step closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire that had smoldered for nearly a decade. They all died. My wife, my children, your brother, trapped in the dark. But you walked away. A man who walks away when a whole family perishes owes a debt. A debt of suffering, a debt of despair. I am here to collect. The truth, in all its horrifying detail, crashed down on Matthew. This was not just a vendetta. It was a symphony of revenge. Kane didn't just believe Matthew was responsible for his family's death. He believed Matthew had escaped a fate he deserved. And he had meticulously orchestrated this entire charade, the death of Matthew's daughter, the robbery, the indenture to strip him of everything he loved, to make him feel the same agonizing loss that Kane himself had endured piece by painful piece. This wasn't punishment. It was a slow, deliberate demolition of a man's soul. Hope arrived in the form of a traveling merchant named Nicholas Gutierrez. A man with a kind face and shrewd eyes, he had been a guest at the boarding house for a week, observing the quiet cruelties of Mrs. Whitman's establishment, with a disapproval he did not bother to hide. He had seen the public beating, and the look of disgust on his face had been genuine. He sought out Ruth in the pre-dawn hours, finding her scrubbing the front porch, her movements stiff with pain. "I want to help you," he said, his voice low. Ruth eyed him with the ingrained suspicion of the powerless. Why? "Let's just say I have no love for Silas Kane." Nicholas replied, his expression hardening. "Years ago, he was my business partner. He used my capital to secure a land grant and then used a legal loophole to cut me out, leaving me with nothing. I've spent years rebuilding. Kane preys on the weak. He crushed you and that man in the cellar for his own satisfaction. I find I cannot abide that." He laid out a plan. He would offer to buy both her and Matthew's indenture contracts from Mrs. Whitman, under the guise of needing experienced help for a new trading post he was establishing in the mountains. But their freedom was only the first step. "Getting you out of Millbrook isn't enough," Nicholas explained, his voice intense. "Kane will hunt you. He has a long reach. We need to destroy him. We need proof of his crimes, something that will put him away for good. I suspect the proof is in his office, in his private ledgers. Proof of the bribes, the fraudulent land deals, maybe even something about the mine." The escape was no longer a simple flight to freedom. It became a high-stakes operation. Nicholas, a master of negotiation, spent 2 days haggling with Mrs. Whitman, finally striking a deal for an exorbitant sum that made the widow's eyes gleam with greed. While the papers were being drawn, the second part of the plan went into motion. The night before their departure was moonless and cold. Matthew, freed from his cellar by Nicholas, who'd claimed he needed him to load the wagon early, met Ruth and the merchant in the alley behind the boarding house. Kane's office was on the second floor of the bank building, its window facing the back alley. The infiltration was a study in nerve-shredding tension. Matthew, using his strength and agility, scaled a drain pipe to the second-story ledge. The window was locked, but with a thin knife provided by Nicholas, he painstakingly worked the latch free. He slipped inside a shadow in a room filled with darker shadows. The office smelled of leather cigar smoke and money. A massive oak desk dominated the space, and a heavy iron safe stood against the far wall. Working by the slivered moonlight, he searched the desk. He found ledgers filled with numbers, land deeds, and contracts, all meaningless to him. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against a small, locked box at the back of a deep drawer. It was too heavy to be just papers. He forced the lock with the knife, the snap of the metal sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside, nestled amongst a stack of yellowed papers, was a single thick engineering report bound in leather. The title on the cover read, Blackwood Ridge Mine Structural Assessment. Beneath it lay a smaller private ledger. Matthew tucked both inside his shirt. As he turned to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside the office door. Panic seized him. He scrambled for the window, his heart pounding in his throat. He heard a key turning in the lock. He threw one leg over the sill just as the door began to swing open. He didn't wait to see who it was. He launched himself from the ledge, landing hard in the alley below the impact, jarring his teeth. Ruth and Nicholas helped him up, their faces pale with fear in the gloom. They didn't speak, didn't look back. They simply melted into the darkness, the proof of Cain's sins, a heavy weight against Matthew's chest. Their freedom had been bought, not just with Nicholas's coin, but with a risk that had nearly cost them everything. Months later, the ghosts of Millbrook felt 1,000 miles away. The trading post Nicholas had established was nestled in a high mountain valley, a fledgling beacon of civilization in a vast, untamed wilderness. Matthew and Ruth had poured their sweat and their hopes into the place, helping Nicholas raise log walls against the coming winter. Here, surrounded by the towering, silent peaks that were Matthew's true home, they had begun to build a life. The past was a scar, but it was starting to heal. The sandstorm hit without warning. One moment the autumn sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. The next the horizon turned a bruised yellow-brown, and the wind began to howl, a mournful rising shriek that tore through the pines. Sand and grit blasted against the half-finished walls of the main building, finding its way through every crack and crevice. They huddled inside, the three of them, the dim light of a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The roar of the wind was a physical presence, making the new timbers groan in protest. The roof shuddered, and Matthew knew the storm threatened to tear the entire structure apart. The storm was their ticking clock. And then, through the maelstrom, they heard it, the sound of approaching horses. Matthew grabbed his rifle, exchanging a grim look with Nicholas. No sane traveler would be out in this. The door burst open, and Silas Cain stood there, framed against the swirling chaos. He was no longer the polished gentleman of Millbrook. His fine coat was torn and plastered with grit, and his face was a mask of obsessive fury. Behind him stood 4 men, hard-faced and carrying rifles, their eyes scanning the room. They weren't lawmen or bounty hunters. They were killers. Cain hadn't come to capture them. He had come to erase them. "You have something of mine?" Cain said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. He took a step into the room, his men fanning out behind him. "It's over, Cain," Nicholas said, his own pistol steady in his hand. "We have the proof. It's all in your reports." Cain laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Reports? You think this is about money? This is about justice." His wild eyes fixed on Matthew. "My family was trapped in that mine. The supports gave way, but it wasn't an accident. You were the foreman's brother, the explosives expert. You set a charge to cover your tracks, to steal the gold from the richest seam, and you collapsed the tunnel on purpose. You buried them alive for a bag of rocks." The accusation, born of years of grief and festering hatred, hung in the air. As Cain spoke, Nicholas made his move. He kicked over a crate of metal goods, creating a deafening clatter that served as a momentary diversion. In that split second, Ruth, who had been near the back of the room, scrambled behind the counter. her hand closing around the heavy leather-bound report they had kept hidden there. The room exploded in a chaos of noise and violence. Gunshots cracked their sound, swallowed by the howling wind. One of Kane's men crumpled to the floor. Matthew shoved a heavy table over, creating a makeshift barricade, firing his rifle over the top. The lantern was hit, plunging the room into a terrifying gloom, lit only by the muzzle flashes of the guns. Through the maelstrom, Matthew's voice rose in a raw, desperate roar, a truth he had carried in silence for 9 long years. I didn't run. I tried to save them. The tunnel was collapsing. Timbers were snapping like twigs. I tried to get to them. He saw Kane's silhouette, a dark shape against the raging storm outside the open door. "Liar!" Kane screamed. "Your wife," Matthew yelled, his voice cracking with the agony of the memory. "She was there with your children." The way back was blocked, but there was another passage, a small one, barely big enough for one person. She pushed me toward it. She told me to save my own daughter first. The gunfire sputtered and died. The only sound was the wind screaming like a banshee. Matthew's words, torn from the deepest part of his soul, echoed in the sudden silence. "My daughter was with me that day. My little Sarah, your wife, made me choose. She told me to save one child if I couldn't save them all. I crawled through that passage, and it collapsed behind me. I got Sarah out, but she was hurt. She died 3 days later." He fumbled inside his shirt and pulled out the locket. "This was my brother's. He gave it to me for her, for my Sarah, named after my wife. The one you had your doctor let die." Ruth held up the report, its pages fluttering in the wind. "It's all here, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Your own engineer's report. You used substandard timber supports to save money. You knew the mine was unstable. You killed them." The truth hit Silas Kane with the force of a physical blow. His vendetta, the all-consuming purpose that had driven him for 9 years, was built on a lie. His hatred was a monument to his own greed. His wife hadn't been a victim of Matthew's crime. She had been a hero, sacrificing her own life and her children's for the chance to save another child. And he, in his blind rage, had hunted down and tormented the man she had saved, even orchestrating the death of that man's second child. He stared at Matthew, his face a canvas of shattered disbelief. The gun slipped from his fingers, thudding unnoticed onto the sandy floor. He was a man hollowed out, broken not by bullets, but by a truth more devastating than any weapon. The fight was over. Nicholas and the wounded trappers who had been in the back room quickly subdued his remaining men. But Silas Kane just stood there, a statue in the storm, already a prisoner of a hell far worse than any jail cell. In the days that followed, the wind died down, and a profound quiet settled over the valley. The sky, washed clean by the storm, was a deep, tranquil blue. The community of trappers and travelers at the post came together, helping to repair the damaged roof and walls, their shared labor a silent testament to their newfound solidarity. Nicholas, his arm in a sling from a stray bullet, gathered the evidence, Kane's ledger, the engineering report, and the sworn testimony of his captured gunmen. He rode out with 2 other men, bound for the nearest federal marshal's office, determined to see that Silas Kane would face justice, not only for the events at the trading post, but for the long-buried crimes of Blackwood Ridge. With the external threat gone, a different kind of stillness fell between Matthew and Ruth. There were things that had been brought into the light that could not be unseen. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the quiet between them was thick with unspoken words. Matthew finally broke the silence, his voice low and heavy. He spoke of his first wife, Sarah, and the guilt he had carried over her death. Then he spoke of the mine, of the terror, and the impossible choice Kane's wife had forced upon him. For the first time, he allowed himself to mourn her, to mourn his brother, and to mourn the tiny daughter, his first Sarah, who had died in his arms. The guilt he had carried for surviving had been a poison in his soul, and the telling of it was the first dose of the antidote. The locket, he explained, holding it in his palm, the silver warm from the firelight. My brother gave it to me for her. When Lily got sick, it felt like I was losing a child all over again. I looked at that locket, and all I could think was that I couldn't fail another daughter. He finally looked at Ruth, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost black. Robbing that bank. It was a madness born of grief. I just couldn't bear to lose another one. Ruth listened, her heart aching for him, for the layers of tragedy he had carried alone for so long. When he was finished, she took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said softly. He held her hand tightly, the first tears he had shed in years, tracing clean paths through the grime on his face. He was free, not just from Cain's chains, but from the prison of his own past. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, Ruth came to Matthew as he was carving a piece of pine wood. She stood before him, a quiet, radiant smile on her face, and placed his hand on her belly. He felt the gentle, unmistakable flutter of new life beneath his palm. The news settled over them, not with shock, but with a sense of rightness, of a cycle being completed. A new beginning born not from the ashes of their past, but from the strong foundation they had built together. A year later, they made a journey. With their newborn son Daniel bundled warmly in Ruth's arms, they rode to the overgrown, forgotten gravesite at Blackwood Ridge. The place was quiet, the wind whispering through the tall pines that had grown up around the collapsed mine entrance. Simple wooden crosses, weathered and gray, marked the resting place of those who had been lost. Matthew walked to the largest cross, the one that marked the grave of Silas Cain's wife and children. He took the silver locket from around his neck, the one with the Blackwood J, and gently placed it on the weathered stone at the base of the cross. It was a gesture of peace, of forgiveness, a letting go of the last remnants of a shared terrible history. Then he walked to a smaller, unmarked plot of earth nearby, where his brother and his first daughter lay. From his satchel, he took the piece of pine he had been working on. It was a small, exquisitely carved bird, a mountain jay, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He placed the wooden bird on the ground, a new marker for a memory he no longer had to bear alone. He straightened up and took Ruth's hand. They stood for a moment, a family of three silhouetted against the vast, wild landscape. Then they turned and walked away, not towards an easy life, but towards a free one, a life earned through truth and sacrifice, and a love strong enough to withstand any storm. Their trading post, visible in the distance, was a warm light in the valley, a beacon of true justice and unyielding resilience.